All right, whenever you're ready.
Am I audible and visible?
Yep, you're good.
I find it incredibly funny how OG concedes that Pinochet will cause instability and expect that they get some level of equivalent returns on their side anyway. First of all, if you read the info slide, it specifically says that you're not going to get equitable distribution because your distribution is based off of your contribution and your wages and stuff like that, even on your side of the house, which means that you don't get the equity push that you claim. But second, on stable populations, like I don't care that they're a Catholic country. The global fertility rate goes up and down. This is a variable that the government has to deal with that we don't have to deal with because we have things like investment, which they don't get access to because of the multifaceted nature of government incentives. That is to say, if I'm a government and I have to hedge against things like famines and stuff like that, I probably invest in those sort of things. But I also probably invest in things like infrastructure projects and stuff like that. Stuff that doesn't create direct returns, which you get on our side of the house because because pension fund managers invest their own money and hence carry the risk and the reward with the investments that they make. This is particularly crucial and is mentioned in Brian's speech. Notice that OG gives you no response to this. But second, on state obligation, like yes, the state has an obligation, but they have to be able to uphold this obligation in the first place. Presumably, if they don't have the capacity because of instabilities and stuff like that, they can't do it. But equally speaking, let's say the pension fund that is private is in like a shit ton of trouble. If you want to accept anything that OG says, you also have to accept that the state will back these pension funds because the pension funds are acting in the interest of the welfare of the people, which means that you're likely to have state backing if you want to believe anything that OG says. You just get better, like you get it better on our side because you get investment, which means that you get increased returns and stuff like that. I find it really funny how OG want to talk about corruption because they literally start off by saying that there is like, I don't know, instability and it's Pinochet and stuff like this, which means that you're far more likely to have stuff like cronyism and embezzlement on their side of the house than you are on our side of the house, given you're like liable to things like a board of directors and stuff like that and stakeholders and shareholders on our side of the house, which you're not on their side of the house. But equally speaking, you're likely to make your investments well because notice you're profit maximizing, but like in a stable manner. That is to say, your purpose is not for high investments. It's probably for like good returns that are like not super risky, which probably means that you hedge and you diversify your investments and stuff like this to get better returns. Why is it easy to pivot? One, I think there is an extremely high incentive for you to increase your return. That is to say, the population probably has an incentive to co-opt this system in the first place because they know that they're like, I don't know, more diversified, more protected, stuff like this. But second, when you know that it's your own individual investment that comes as a return to you, you have a increased incentive to be financially literate and stuff like this, which just generally means that you're more likely to pivot into a system that gives you better returns, that is more secure and stuff like this. We think this is why it's easy to pivot, but I think the motion warrants for this anyway. They say you don't have a stable economy to invest in. This is just like fucking crazy because presumably this fucks them more than it fucks us, right? Like, I don't understand why you get the returns that you talk about on your side. Presumably, if the economy is unstable, like unstable, you don't get the returns on your side either. But also, you have to worry about things like famines and embezzlement and like money having to be put in elsewhere in education and healthcare and stuff like that. The list is endless because the government has multifaceted interests on your side of the house. The private pension funds solely care about like increasing the value of your pension, stuff like this, which means they probably invest it. But second, even at our worst, let's say the economy is completely screwed and you can't create like a return out of your investments domestically. You just invest abroad. Like this is something that pension funds can do that governments can't, which means that you still hedge against this as well. You probably get more returns on our side of the house. I think the equity push I already dealt with. I don't think you get that. Third, why do you get more economic growth on our side of the house through like the AFP or whatever? Whatever. I think one, because PAYG works on a system of redistribution. That is to say, you take mandatory individual contributions in the current generation and you use it to pay off like the current like group of people who are seeking a pension. The simple reason that this is true is because the state does not have the capacity to invest its money in return generating investments because of its like multifaceted nature of its interests. That is to say, the state has a variety of reasons, a variety of things to invest in things like infrastructure projects and stuff like education. And this is good. And we think that this should happen anyway, but this is stuff that happens through taxpayer money, not through pension funds. And hence, it's far more likely that you get the real return just through pension funds on our side of the house because you don't have this like diversity of incentives on our side of the house. But second, the state has to deal with with things like population uncertainty. We don't have to because we get things like, because investment literally hedges against this. You're getting a growth on the amount of money you put in. You don't get this on their side of the house. There is far more uncertainty on their side of the house for this, which means that things like fertility rate play a role and stuff like that. But last, on inflation, I think this is a far bigger issue on their side of the house because presumably your money is less valuable today than it was yesterday. We hedge against this as well by like investing our money into different things and like, I don't know, just like diversifying our investment to ensure that you actually get some sort of real growth out of your money and to push against things like inflation, stuff like this. The impact of this is multifold. The first is that on gov bench you have bad utilization of pension funds and because you have multifaceted incentives. But second, why is the AFP management of pensions better? I think one, because you're a private investor, which means that you don't have multiple incentives. You just want to use your investment to create the most amount of money. But second, notice the structure of pension funds, right? I think you have capital that you get from the people who invest capital into their pension funds. The AFP invests the money into various stocks, bonds, and other investments like real estate and stuff like that. And you probably hedge better as an AFP because you have an incentive to take on risky and non-risky investments and stuff like this. But just generally make sure that this money grows to some degree so that you can return the money to a great extent, because the more you create a reputation for yourself in doing this well, the more amount of capital you get in, the more amount of profit you're able to make, which means that you have an incentive to do this well as well, but you also have the capacity to do it well because you don't have to worry about things like infrastructure projects and stuff like that. The impact of this is also multifold because one, you have massive investment domestically, and this is crucial because AFP and private pension funds invest domestically in things like capital markets and other companies, stocks and bonds and stuff like this. What this means is that, and this is empirically true, is that Chilean businesses and startups have massive amounts of capital available to them on our side of the house that you don't on their side of the house. Before I move on, POI from closing or opening.
Yes, panel, do notice that governments already have to deal with keeping markets stable. They have to do those like demographic policies. They have to distribute workers
Yes,
by fields. It's
but
not
this is exactly
unique.
what I'm saying. This is a factor you have to deal with that we don't. We sidestep this altogether by not worrying about public policy and we only care about the investment and how it's dealt with. We invest better, we hedge better, we don't have to worry about other incentives. All of those reasons, I think we win on that. But second, I think what this means is that you get far more Chilean businesses and startups. This is also empirically true. But third, the return that people get is significantly higher, which means people can put food on their table because you have like you have a growing economy as a result of this because fund managers put their own money and this dictates their salaries, and hence there is a reason to do this. But also you're protected from population change and stuff like this. I think just generally speaking, this is a good thing. But crucially, you get more foreign direct investment for two reasons. One, because you signal a strong market because of increased investment in capital markets and things like companies and bonds and stuff like that. But second, you grow the domestic industry to show like potential in Chile as a whole, which means that you just get more FDI because there is more potential. But last, on risks, I think OG literally concede the Pinochet is risky stuff. I think PAYG like could literally lose their money because of things like famines and stuff like that. But you also lose money to things like inflation and stuff like this. I think we hedge far better because you actually make sure your investments are diverse and you make sure that your money actually reaches the actual individual who invests the money. All those reasons opening opposition.
All right, thanks, Diallo. Call upon the MG.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yep, visible and audible.
Alrighty, wonderful. Wait 1 second. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1, go. Dear panel, we hear a lot of mumbo jumbo about economics and whatever, and everybody tries to act very smart. But here's the thing. We're going to try to be a little bit more intuitive. I'm first going to talk about like why this is actually just to begin with a really bad system and something that nobody has mentioned. And second of all, about like how people, the average person actually acts. So first of all, what exactly has changed whenever we have this policy? The thing that has changed is that like current retired people need to still be funded by the general budget. And instead, like the situation that we have at hand is that like everyone else is moving to like this privately funded these private pools or whatever, but we still have a very huge pool of like of retired people that need to still get money. And because we already mentioned that Chile has a demographic crisis, this is a great number of people that still need that money, and generally this is going to place the Chile in a very bad situation. So the big issue here, and the primary thing that we're going to talk about, is that the idea that like you create a very serious void in the budget of the country and the way that you're going to actually be able to help people. For instance, the people that like OG talks about, and for instance, the demographic crisis that like opening opposition tries to talk about. First of all, why can this not be funded, this void that is now being created by this general system? First of all, like we already mentioned, the government has very little money right now, primarily due to the economic shocks that have occurred, the political pressure, and so on and so forth. Second of all, there are no workers, like I already said, to fund these general pools. So you're not actually having a stable source of income or source of like percentage tax that you can place on people in order to have this retirement fund. Third of all, no workers, no. There is very little economic infrastructure whenever it comes to actually mitigating this issue, and like as a country. This means that the country currently runs on a general deficit already. Second of all, it was recently overthrown, so you have a lot of political pressures and a lot of different places you need to put money into that are really important. In general, it just bottles up to the general fact that you have to spend a lot of money in this situation without an existing mechanism to actually gain money from somewhere else, right? So this creates a very bad void. Now, why is this specifically an issue that is unique and asymmetrical on our side? First of all, because a demographic crisis, like they're trying to say on the other side, is a long-term problem that is fully capable of being mitigated in some fashion. The newer policies in terms of how you handle, for instance, like how you fund, for instance, children or whatever, if a family decides to have a child, or like, for instance, like general policies that you can enact in order to like mitigate it. This is a long-term issue. We can see that this is probably going to be something that has to be dealt with, but it's long-term. The problem now occurs is that you create a very short-term issue because you immediately need money, but everyone else is moving away from the system and doesn't fund it anymore. So you create this void, and this is asymmetrical and unique on our side because we don't have an existing mechanism whenever it comes to like actually solving this. Now, why does the old system fix this? It fixes this because you at least have a currently functioning system that is capable of giving retired people their money and is capable of like keeping them alive. And second of all, you have money and you have time in order to build necessary infrastructure and the necessary projects in order to ensure that things work later. Also, why are you incentivized to actually do this well? Well, you're incentivized because there is already a lot of existing political pressure within the country. You're already being looked at how well you do. People primarily care about like their funds and like how well, like the money that they get. Retirement issues are like some of the most important issues to a general population whenever we have an election or whatever. So generally, you're going to be very incentivized to do things well because you don't want to make the same mistakes as the past, and you also just generally want to be capable of being reelected. Very basic. To either cut the pension in order to ensure that you can like generally sustain this pool, so less people, for instance, so people who are already getting pensions are going to earn less money in pension, or on the other hand, you have to cut important infrastructure that still benefits these people. Because like, for instance, we were talking about blue collar workers. Blue collar workers already live pretty shitty lives, like we've already analyzed, and because the government doesn't, this is primarily because the government doesn't necessarily regulate the way in which like they're being treated. It doesn't create projects in terms of like I don't know, worker treatment and like trying to like have like the proper money or whatever. It doesn't necessarily matter. The idea is that those projects, for instance, don't exist right now. The moment at which you create a budget void, you cut the existing incentive to actually enact such projects. So realistically here, we don't necessarily even have to give you the incentive analysis for why you're actually going to, for instance, enact these projects. They're not going to happen to begin with, primarily because now we have this policy at hand. And like this also leads to all kinds of other things, like just social welfare, education, and things like that, because you are forced to make cuts in order to be able to sustain the system. Another thing that it leads to, like you already 1 second. Oh, something to engage a little bit with, like what opening opposition said, for instance, because they were saying about, like, for instance, how this is going to improve the economy of Chile. Sure, even if we take you at your best and the economy of Chile improves and like it starts earning more money, this leads to a situation in which all of that money actually has to be funneled into like sustaining the retirement budget and like waits for a very long period of time in order for those people to die and then go back to actually sustaining the country itself. So you don't actually see any benefit for people that are in need in this case. I'll take a POI from opening.
Yeah, this house regrets. If our policy actually worked, you can't prove that it won't. But more importantly, the cash hole that you prove kills any chance of all of this infrastructure investment that you attempt to co-opt actually manifesting.
Okay, I'm saying that it doesn't. I'm saying right now that it doesn't work. Then, sure. in the country. So even under a regret motion, this still stays as an analysis that I've given to you. Right, and like very quickly about how people in general act. Now that we see that the system in general just doesn't work, the other thing is that, like, first of all, people are incredibly short-termistic, right? You already have very huge economic shocks. You already have problems. You already have problems with your money. So if there is a very serious problem, you are always trying to cling onto any resources that you can immediately get. So why do we think that people, for instance, are not going to be able to keep their pensions even under the new system, even if it exists? Because like by the current system, you control the money, but because it's like privately organized or whatever, you control the money for your pension or like retirement fund directly, meaning that this is relatively easy money that you have at hand. If you are in need, you're just going to use it. In case an economic shock occurs for you to deal with, because for instance, if you have no money, things are bad. So this is problematic because you no longer have a long-term economic stability. When you retire, you're not going to have money, and when an economic shock occurs, you're screwed. Vote us.
Right, thanks to the MG. Call upon the MO.
All right, can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Wonderful. Okay, then I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Two very simple claims from closing opposition, then comprehensive weighing. First, why does the PAYG system collapse? Secondly, what are the spillover economic benefits we get from this? Weighing and proving this far higher than opening opposition. First, why does the system collapse? The basic extent of the top half clash on this is like, maybe there's something about like fertility rate being super low, or there's exogenous reasons why total fertility rate might drop. So that's why the system collapses. This is a like pretty uniquely terrible mechanism in the context of Chile, because they infamously had an extremely high total fertility rate, both because Pinochet was ridiculously oppressive to women and made them have lots of children. So many, in fact, that he famously like stole lots of them from women, and there had to be truth and reconciliation commissions about that. But secondly, this also just doesn't structurally explain like why the system will collapse long term if the government can indeed just adjust to the rate at which pays out pensions. So the better mechanism here is that we reduce participation in the informal economy, which was especially a risk after a large-scale catastrophe to collect. Workers don't own their contributions. They're essentially a tax. So this means that you have a reduced incentive to participate in the formal economy and increased incentive to participate in the informal economy. On the comparative, when you have personal ownership of your pension funds, your contribution is more politically and psychologically acceptable, which encourages formal labor market participation and thus creates a culture of individual savings, which means that we get buy-in to the pension funds in the first place. This is just a far stronger mech than what opening opposition gives you, explaining why there's high initial buy-in to the pension funds in the first place, which probably just is a prerequisite to any of GovBench's impact. So that pretty neatly weighs out there. But secondly, what I want to spend the majority of this speech talking about are just the spillover economic benefits, which is that we get substantially higher investment for two reasons, proving this a lot bigger than opening opposition. So under PAYG, contributions are immediately paid out to current retirees. So you're not able to get investment. So comparatively, we actually invest in the economy and stimulate firms. Opening opposition says this, but they're missing a critical burden here, which is why does Chile have the capacity to grow with this investment, particularly in a time of economic instability like the round characterizes? There are three reasons here. First, Chile was able to exploit natural resources. Chile is extremely rich in many rare earth minerals or other valuable natural resources, which gives investors guaranteed returns even in times of instability. So you're able to invest in things like local mining operations, for instance, which are less sensitive to the background economic context, which might otherwise be more volatile. Secondly, you do actually just have a large young population for business creation. So like OG is kind of right. Chile did have one of the high TFRs, but then if that's the case, we would just rather that businesses be investing in the population that's like actually participating in the economy instead of the population that's like currently retired and isn't making the economy bigger for you. The third is an increasingly educated population in the aftermath of the Pinochet reforms that decentralized universities, which led to a substantial increase in university enrollment. So the Chilean population was getting increasingly educated and upskilled at this time, which meant that particularly into the trajectory of the 90s and early 2000s, we were able to capitalize on this for an environment of young, fertile business creation. So this gave three mechanisms specific to the Chilean context, explaining we would much rather have this money being reinvested into the economy instead of just being paid out to pensioners, which means that we get much higher economic growth on net. The second thing here I want to prove is foreign direct investment. What does opening opposition say in the last 10 seconds of their DLO speech on this? One, signaling, and two, bigger business. Their second mechanism is a contingent on the mechanisms which I filled in above. The first mechanism on signaling, they just basically say the word signaling, we're going to make the argument. The argument here is that private actors are often multinational and are seen as much more credible. These are firms that have ties with other nations and bring with them the expertise and credibility of foreign investors like the United States. This is particularly a context where US economic hegemony was extremely strong during the 80s and 90s. AFPs accumulated billions of dollars in savings that had to be invested, which means that to absorb this capital, Chile had to build stock exchanges, corporate bond markets, and regulatory frameworks with international backing. This is what kicks in the investor confidence mechanism. The institutional infrastructure that international firms provided gave Chilean firms not only access to capital, but a platform to issue bond shares and raise funds. This is the first mechanism on confidence. Second mechanism on confidence. American firms under Reagan had exogenous incentives to ensure that Pinochet's regime was stable, to ensure that socialists did not take over. Yes, there was eventually a popular revolt against Pinochet, but because American business interests were so already entrenched in the country, this ensured that a socialist takeover did not eventually happen. So there are exogenous political reasons why the American government would have been willing to direct private firms to invest in Chile in the presence of the AFP system. Thirdly, substantially better credit ratings, and this is a huge mechanism. AFPs became the largest holder of Chilean government bonds or international bonds, which creates a stable domestic creditor base. This means that you pay interest more consistently, which raises your credit ratings, which means you're able to borrow for cheaper at better rates because investors are willing to take a risk on lower interest rates because the perception of default is lower. Comparatively, your credit rating is worse not only because they lower investment in the first place, but because PAYG systems often defaulted on loans they took out because of a moral hazard with the expectation that the government would bail them out in the first place. So not only is there a much worse credit rating on the comparative, but you're able to build up the credit rating on international forums with respect to things like the IMF or the WTO. This means that when your credit rating is substantially better, you can afford to finance and borrow for infrastructure investment substantially cheaper, which improves economic growth massively. Final huge burden OO never proves. What is the scale and margin of this FDI? It's very large for two reasons. First, because confidence compounds over time. As Chile is able to prove that it's economically stable in the aftermath of a substantial shock to its economy in the form of the Pinochet revolts, investors are able to park their capital in and create longer-term investments because you've weathered that initial shock, which means that your scale of investment increases over time. But secondly, you're able to escape the debt crises of the 1990s across Latin America, brought on by the devaluing of the Mexican peso, which many economies were pegged to because they're more entrenched in international markets. This means that Chile was able to weather the Mexican debt crisis relatively well because they're perceived as a relative safe haven among Latin American countries that had more offshore investments in the comparatively more stable United States, which means that international investors were able to come into Chile during this period uniquely as well. The upshot of all of this, FDI surges massively into mining, finance, infrastructure, telecommunications investment, all things which substantially increase economic growth. Weighing this versus every other argument in the round, OO's best proven terminal impact is that returns for pensioners are higher. But one, pensioners are a small portion of the population. Young people matter too. We want growth to be higher for existing workers. And two, growth is a prerequisite to higher returns. If we get better economic growth regardless, everyone in the economy benefits from better infrastructure investment. Everyone benefits from having better roads, better schools, better hospitals. The prerequisite to all of this is foreign direct investment coming in during a uniquely volatile period for Chile's economy. You only get this under the AFP system and not the terrible PAYG system. Incredibly proud to oppose.
Okay, thanks, Mo. Call upon the GovWhip.
Second. Am I visible and audible?
Yep, you're visible and audible.
Thank you. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna start with some quick engagement with like the CEO speech that came just before mine. So I'm not gonna pretend that I understand all of that like deep economical stuff, but a few problems with the case that they're trying to run. First of all, they're trying to prove that like Chile will generally just become like way more marketable to foreign investors. Like generally, one certain problem, one like a major issue with that is like as Chile is becoming like progressively more politically unstable, and it's already politically unstable due to the changes in dictatorships and so on and so forth, and due to the fact that its neighboring countries are generally relatively more economically stable and also have those same type of like natural resources, so on and so forth. This doesn't make Chile necessarily more like marketable towards like foreign investments and that kind of stuff. Secondly, foreign investors and companies are already trying to orient themselves into like even more like economically disparaging countries. So Chile is not like uniquely offering them like, for example, tax benefits or like lower worker prices or the things that foreign investors are generally looking for. They've already established themselves kind of in like even more poorer like developing countries than Chile itself. Secondly, like already says that like those like private investors, due to the fact that they need to hedge against the market and like the Chile economy is like currently as of right now unstable, they're more likely to be able to invest in like foreign sorts of markets, which like limits the amount of capital that is like reaching the impacts that CEO are trying to claim. Like thirdly, the thing they say, they just give some spec on like Chile mining, and they say, oh, you're just gonna invest in mining. Note that this is already a very growing industry. This is an industry that is already very big and like very invested into. Like as they say, it's very stable and already making quite a lot of profit. So this is not an industry that is likely gonna gain a lot of revenue for being invested in. Like this is just not gonna make a good investment because investment companies are not gonna like make like a big a sort of like marginal profit out of that and those sorts of things. Also note that because those like private companies or like private investors, private pension funds are likely to be very risk averse, they're not likely to be investing into companies that are currently growing or like expanding the market or like expanding the economy in those sorts of particular way. What they're likely trying to do is invest in like already growing companies. They're in companies that have proved like stable growth throughout the years in stable economies that could even be like foreign and stuff, which means that we're just not creating that many like economic opportunities in Chile as like the CEO are trying to claim, which is I think makes their impact like in this debate very marginal. To continue on, like why is the government likely to like be? I'll take POIs later. I'll ask on fifth. Like why are governments likely to be able to make those investments like kind of good? Like first of all, notice that like is generally likely to invest like way safer. First of all, it has a way larger pool of capital, so it's like way it's way easier to hedge like to hedge and invest and like risk hedge against itself and that sort of thing, just because it has like a way larger pool, makes investment way safer. Second of all, government has like the reach to the most amount of experts physically possible, because it's first of all very prestigious to sort of like work for the government and manage those funds, and second of all, due to the fact that it was like recently a dictatorship, they were like likely able to draw in a lot of the good talent into those government facilities. And why the government already has incentive to do that? Well, that's very like intuitive. It's because the government is the one that has to bail out the bad investments that it does on its own pension fund. It's gonna have to bail out its own market. So like they have incentive to invest this money well, or invest it into projects that are likely to be able to pay out sort of quickly, or invest into those government mines that the CEO is already mentioning, so they don't have to bail out those people. Now some quick like engagement with like our opening. So what our opening say is like basically, okay, they're very contingent on the assertion that this government is going to be very volatile and it's going to be it's not going to function very well, and no thank you, and it's going to like function badly. They never prove this assertion. We never understand why the government will be problematic, while why that dictator is likely to huddle up with like different pension funds, as they say. Like they're way more contingent on like assertions and things they haven't proven. Second of all, why we pass our opening is like because we're just a lot more short-termistically short. Like what we say is like our impacts are way more probable just because they're way more short-termistic. But that does not mean that our impacts are small. What my first speaker is already said to you is that like we're gonna have this big void. So for example, people that are already like in pension right now, they may be like 65. Those people probably have like 20 to 30 years to live. The moment we change that system, there is no longer any money going into like those pension funds. So those people's pensions, first of all, have to be significantly reduced in order for the government to not have to spend a lot of money, meaning that those people generally live disproportionately worse lives and so on and so forth. They just don't have the money to like die in dignity in that sort of way. They have to scrape for food. They have to do all those sorts of things. And second of all, we're not reaping any of the benefits of any sort of economic progress that is happening, because all of that, like our economic growth that is happening in Chile, that's already not very unstable, is having to go to that pension fund so we can give that to those people that are like already about to die. PY opening.
15 seconds. You can't win this debate because you don't explain why you can comparatively navigate economic volatility and cronyism better. And additional impacting on sufficient analysis from us as to why this investment happens well cannot win CO this debate because foreign investors.
Okay. Thank you. I'm gonna start engaging with like right now. First of all, like a few of the things they say, okay, like funds are just generally gonna manage better. They're gonna grow the economy, so on and so forth. First of all, note those funds, those private investors are likely to be very predatory. Note a lot of people in Chile don't have the economic knowledge to be able to pick their like pension funds well, and there's a knowledge gap just because of the fact that requires a lot of like previous like information based on like education and that sort of stuff. Second of all, notice that this field is generally new, and third of all, notice that the companies that have the good investors, they're likely gonna charge them just like higher prices, and the people that are poor, they're gonna have to go to the smaller like pension funds and pension investors, and those people are likely gonna be way more predatory towards them because they're gonna offer them like, okay, we're gonna take a lower entry fee from you, but they're gonna have way worse conditions, so those people will just have like very diminishing pensions. Second of all, note average person does not have a good investment strategy. The moment that person is hungry, they're gonna stop investing in their pension funds. They're gonna fuck over their pension funds, or the moment that person loses their job or that sort of thing, it's just way more personally volatile, that sort of thing. And my first speaker already mitigated the demographic crisis. Government is already dealing with this, and it's mandated to deal with this because the market otherwise will crash. Thank you. Vote CG.
Okay, thanks, GovWhip. Call upon OpWhip.
All right. Okay. Time will start now. I'm not going to lie, this has been pretty clear. What's the case that Will gives you? We are the only team that explains that not only can we avoid the imminent crisis that Chile is facing, that OO only hints at, and Will explains why it's coming and what specifically causes it. And then not only this, we are able to weather future storms and build stability in a fundamentally unstable economy post-coup and have a system that survives up until this day with more competent leaders can giving consistent returns to the nation as a whole. What do we hear from CG in response? First, we get told that investors are not going to like Chile because they are unstable and there are neighboring countries which are more stable. Note that they don't tell you any neighboring countries which are more stable, but then second, realize that there's always going to be foreign investors for the reason that Will gives you, notably that the United States was the one that just funded the coup that happened in Chile, which means that there's always going to be other actors that are internationally involved and interested in what's going on. Second, they said that foreign investors and companies are trying to go for even worse countries, which means that there's no unique benefit for Chile. Again, well, first, as I'm getting repetitive already, but we'll explain to you the unique benefits, but then second, realize that there's always going to be marginal opportunities that are created when there's internal stability that is grown, when Chile can provide both the domestic stability of financial systems and markets underneath the eye of a fascist dictator that is supporting the growth of economic systems and markets, but at the same time have the natural resources that Chile's fellow neighbor countries can also have. This is a great situation for companies that can handle the situation with low regulations all around and exist in a pretty business-friendly environment. Third, they say that the mining industry is already growing, will be big no matter what. But this is a question of the margin of the scale, because as Will tells you, confidence compounds. Insofar as we begin to build some more investment, that begins to scale upon itself. Insofar as we are able to prove a departure in growth in one industry, this means that it will also spill over into other industries. And then four, they say that investors are trying to invest into companies that are already growing, which are stable, not creating new opportunities. Not only does this not respond to our impact, as companies that are growing can grow even larger and create new economic opportunities for people, this functionally concedes our case when they do argue that, when they concede that other nations are going to be coming in and doing good and positive investment. What does this mean? This means that our case has the largest scope in the round, because rather than just hinting at vague structures that may cause problems in the future, we can point at individual things like the peso crisis and like the financial instability that followed right after the Pinochet coup that would have fundamentally crashed the PAYG system and in situations where Chile became a financial hub throughout history. While OO's mechanization may be about the generic pension system, we can explain why we don't specifically regret it in a Chilean context. But let's move on to do some responses. What do we hear from CG in their case? We basically hear different flavors of AFP really, really bad, but let's handle it in a couple of ways. First, I think their demographic crisis, in which they draw their uniqueness argument from, is a little bit silly. No one in this round has ever insisted that Chile had a demographic crisis. It was only a speculation that OO hinted at that they could have a demographic crisis in the future. As we understand, they are simply stable because they have a very Catholic culture, and obviously, as Will explains, Pinochet enforced that Catholic culture in a very dominant manner, and families are having 5 to 6 to 7 children, which means that there is not going to be a demographic crisis. Second, we can look to history, right? There wasn't a massive void that needed to be filled in after Pinochet took over and the system switched. This wasn't a crisis that happened. This is a retroactively looking regrets motion. This isn't too specky to assert this. Third, even if this gap did happen, they just assert that the government couldn't fill it in. Notably, the government at this point is still receiving massive amounts of foreign aid from the United States. The United States has been funding the healthcare system of other dictatorships and fascist nations like Israel around the world, so I don't think they would have a problem, especially in the 80s when their entire doctrine was to fund friendly dictators insofar as they were anti-communist, to simply just allow the system to continue running. But then last, this double turns their own case, because if the government doesn't have enough money to fund a system, why would it be better to buy into a government-funded system where the government intrinsically has to manage, pay for the management of, and make sure that there's no mismanagement of a system which is probably not very high on their priorities? Insofar as you are having worse managers and a fascist government that cares less about social services, as I pointed out in a POI to OG, credit us for this, not OO, but this means that this is fundamentally a defense against their case, because even if they win that people are buying into the system and they have enough money, it doesn't get implemented well. With that, let's respond to OG. What do we hear from OG? We have 4 lines of argumentation. Most of them are pretty handled by OO, but I'll do some more responding as well. On their argument about the competitive incentive, I think that unhandled, this is entirely non-unique. Insofar as we are able to choose which AFP an individual invests in, or that negotiation happens on the corporate level, where members of the government can negotiate with which AFP, you are able to get fees down to an all-time low. You are able to get more transparency, because this is how capitalism works. You can say a lot about Pinochet, but he was an ideologically motivated capitalist. That's why the United States chose him to be their representation. Second, they say that state management is good. I think my POI already takes out this point, so I don't think it's important to reference it again. Third, they say that like dictatorship is going to happen no matter what, but I think our case also incredibly aligns with this. Is there a POI? Okay, I tried. I think our case also incredibly aligns with this, because insofar as your pension company can get close to the dictatorship in order to receive better returns for your workers, we think this is pretty symmetric on both sides of the house. And then fourth, they say that this argument about equity means that like you're receiving money and paying in, but this is also already handled. And I think that there's another level to it where if you are a woman that has broken through the system, you are now receiving back less than you are actually deserving, even though on our side of the house, we benefit for individuality and individual responsibility. Insofar as you are making that money, you are receiving the returns for the money that you have made and you have put your labor towards. We think this is also probably principally just or something like that. With that, Why do we way over our opening? A couple of reasons. First, I think we proved to you the scale of the impact of the foreign direct investment, which is more important than you think. Just because they hint at it in the last 3 seconds of their DLO doesn't mean that they get to burn the entire argument for us, because we explain not only incentives for it to continue to grow, but also who exactly is involved in this direct investment and why they get involved. And second, I think that we are able to contextualize this to specific contexts. Okay, they're able to avoid a crisis. We tell you there's a crisis in 15, in 81, and we tell you there's a crisis again in the 90s. Because of this, we are able to put their arguments in a real circumstance in which they actually have impacts. Thank you. So proud. CO.
Okay, thanks, the op whip. I'll have all the speakers leave the room for my panelists and I to deliberate, and we'll be back in 15.